Heavenly Father, we're excited to be here together this morning. We're thankful for the opportunity to come together, to sing your praise, to fellowship, and to look at your word. Father, I pray that your word would speak to us this morning, that we would be desperate for the training that it gives us. Father, we need your word to be steadfast in our loving pursuit of you. Father, I pray that our faith would be strengthened this morning and that you would be glorified. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So if you have your Bibles with you, we will be looking at Matthew chapter 17, continuing our series entitled Our King. And I just want to, just a little disclaimer, in case we missed it. I don't remember if we spoke very much about this, but in case we missed it, I want to rewind just a little bit, because a shift has happened in the narrative of Jesus' life. So as we've been going through Matthew, we've been looking at the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. We turned a corner back in chapter 16. And we talked about it. I don't remember how much we talked about it, but I'm going to talk about it this morning just to make sure that we understand, because it's going to shape the way that we read the rest of the book of Matthew, is the turn that we took back in chapter 16. So just as a kind of brief overview of what we've seen so far in Matthew, in chapters 1 and 2, we saw the lineage and the birth of Jesus and the travels that he underwent as a child. And then in chapter 3, another turning point, we were introduced to John the Baptist, and Jesus was baptized. And after Jesus was baptized, he came up out of the water, and then he went into the wilderness to be tested by Satan. And then when he got back, it said he began his ministry after that. So another turning point there. From chapter 4 until chapter 10, we see Jesus ministering to the people. He's going around teaching about the kingdom of heaven. He's going around healing people. So Jesus is the one that's doing the work. The Pharisees want to come and talk to him. He always has an answer for them. But then in chapter 10, we see another turn, which was Jesus passing his ministry on to the disciples. So up to this point, it had been Jesus doing this, Jesus doing that, Jesus doing this, Jesus talking to the people. And then in chapter 10, we see Jesus, he doing what every good disciple maker does. He's taking the work that he's been doing and he's giving it to other people. He said, now you go do this work. So from chapter 10 until chapter 16, that's kind of the environment that we're in. Jesus is still doing the ministry. He's still healing people. But behind the scenes, we also see that the disciples are doing it as well, that the disciples are now part of that work, which is why I don't think that it's a coincidence that from chapter 11 until 16, there have been almost every other story that we get in that period is the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes coming mad at Jesus. Because the Pharisees, they see what's happening. This man that they are not a big fan of has now brought others into his heresy, and now they're spreading this new message around. So we see the Pharisees over and over and over again, more so than in the earlier parts of Matthew. Now they're trying to take Jesus down. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's because they see what Jesus is doing. But in chapter 16, we see another shift, and it happens after Jesus he speaks with his disciples, and he asked them, who are people saying that I am? Do y'all remember that? And they give him the answer. There's a few ideas floating around out there about who Jesus really is. And then he asked them, who do you say that I am? And Peter comes with the right answer. You are the Son of God. And it says, from that moment, Jesus began to teach them, saying that he was going to have to be killed and raised again. So in chapter 16, we see another shift that is going to color the entire rest of the book of Matthew, which is that now the death of Jesus has been, it's explicit. Jesus has told them, I'm going to be handed over to the authorities, I will be killed, and then I will raise after 3 days. And that is going to loom over everything for the rest of Matthew until it happens. And the reason I bring all that up is because we are approaching Easter. Easter's right around the corner. We're four weeks away. And I think as we approach Easter on the calendar, And as the text approaches Easter over the next few months, that we need to keep in mind that Jesus, he's going to his death. He knows it. Now his disciples know it. And so what Jesus does and what he starts to do here in chapter 16 is he starts to prepare his disciples for that time. He let them know, I'm going to be handed over, I'm going to be killed, I will be raised on the third day, but he is preparing them to be ready when his physical presence is no longer with them. How are they going to stand firm? That's why I think that's a huge piece. Justin talked last week about the transfiguration. So why did Jesus wait so long for that sweet moment of bringing his disciples up on the mountain and letting them see him in all of his radiant glory? It's because he's preparing them. Now they know that Jesus is going to be killed. He's going to be raised on the third day, and Jesus is anchoring them, getting them ready for that time. And part of that preparation was allowing the three disciples to see him in his glory. But continuing from there, Jesus also, he has, over the next 4 weeks specifically, but we're going to see it over as we finish out Matthew, but specifically we're going to just kind of get as close to this as we can. We're going to see that Jesus is training and teaching and equipping his disciples to be ready, to know what it's going to look like to walk in his name without his physical presence with them. So that's what we're going to see. This reminds me of Ephesians chapter 6. It'll be up here on the screen. Ephesians chapter 6. Paul's writing to the Ephesians, and this is a pretty famous passage here, but we're just going to look at verses 10 through 13. He says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm." So what Paul is doing there, he's using an armor, a military imagery to encourage the Ephesians. He gives them this image of putting on armor. One, to let them know that we're in a fight. It's not against flesh and blood, but we're in a fight, and we have to be prepared for it. If we're going to stand firm, we have to be ready for it. There are steps that we must take in order to stand firm. And Jesus, for his disciples, over the next few weeks, for his disciples and for us, that's what he's doing. He wants us to be able to stand firm when he's no longer present. Because that time is coming for the disciples. We were all born and raised in a world where Jesus' physical presence was not with us. That time is approaching for the disciples, and Jesus wants them to be ready. He wants them to stand firm. He wants us to stand firm. So that's going to be the goal over the next 4 weeks as we lead into Easter, is we're going to have this special emphasis on how do we stand firm in a world where Jesus' physical presence is not with us. And the first thing that we're going to see here in Matthew chapter 17, starting in verse 14, is that Jesus wants us to stand firm in faith. So what we're going to see in Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 23, are 5 ways that Jesus, he tells us the importance of faith and encourages us to stand firm in that faith. 5 things that we're going to build in that should, I hope, my goal is, it should help us in our faith. It should help us to stand firm. This is a word, if nobody else in the room needs this message, I need this message to be able to stand firm in my faith. Starting in verse 14, we're going to see that Jesus rebukes faithlessness. Verse 14 through 17, it says, "And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and, kneeling before him, said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. So let's pause there for a moment and look at this scene. I hate to start off on a negative, that Jesus rebukes faithlessness. The overall tone of this passage is not Jesus angry. Jesus, he wants to help. He wants to help people's faith. He wants to build up his disciples' faith, and he wants to help people. He wants to help us. But part of that help is that he has to speak harshly about faithlessness. And what we see here is that a person comes up and it says, will you heal my son? He's an epileptic and he suffers terribly. Now, here in Matthew, he just leaves it at that. He's an epileptic and he's suffering terribly. He said he often falls into fire or falls into water. And this is another time where it's so great that we have other gospels, because both Mark and Luke tell about this account, and they give us more details than what Matthew gives us here. And we're going to be leaning heavily on Mark to fill in some of these gaps. But Mark, in the account of Mark, the father acknowledges that, yes, it's epileptic seizures that the boy is having, but he acknowledges the fact that this is a spirit that has come over the boy that is causing these problems. In fact, in Mark, he even goes on to elaborate and says that the reason the reason that he's falling into fire or falling into water is not just because he happened to be standing next to fire when he went into a fit, was because the spirit is intentionally trying to harm the child. The spirit wants to hurt the kid. So we get all that from Mark. We don't see all that here in Matthew, but he brings this child before Jesus, and he says, I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. So then Jesus in verse 17 responds pretty harshly. He says, faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to bear with you? Which to me is interesting, because Jesus he's done this kind of thing before. It's not abnormal for somebody with demon possession to be brought to Jesus and for him to need to heal them. It's not even abnormal for somebody else to be asking for healing on behalf of another. Like that's all happened before. This is the first time that it's been mentioned that the disciples failed to do the thing that is being requested. So the father, he comes to Jesus and he says, your disciples couldn't do it. Can you do it? I need you to do it. Jesus responds harshly, and I think part of his harshness is that even though the father is asking Jesus for his help, he's not 100% sure that Jesus can help. And we get that from Mark chapter 9, verses 21 through 22. Says, Jesus asked the father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So part of the reason that Jesus responds to rebuke faithlessness is because the Father's request it's dripping with faithlessness. And before we give him too hard of a time, I have to say that I sympathize with him. And I think we should. I think Jesus sympathizes with him. But the idea that we have parents in the room, the idea that he has been caring for his child for we don't know how long. He's been caring for his child, having to diligently watch over him because a spirit at any second could throw him into fire or throw him into water. So this father he's had a hard go of it. He's trying to take care of his child, and so what does he do after who knows how long of living on pins and needles to protect his child? He brings him to the disciples. He's heard about all the miraculous things that the disciples can do. He knows the fame of Jesus has spread through the area, so he brings him to the disciples, and they say, sorry, we can't help. So if I'm this father, I absolutely, I think my faith would be at an all-time low. He's had a hard go of it. He went to the people that he thought could fix it, and they couldn't fix it. So by the time he makes it to Jesus, he's on thin ice. And he says, if you can do anything, please have mercy on him and heal him. So I don't want to be too hard on the guy. Yes, his faith is not where it should be, but how often is it? And Jesus, he points it out. He says, faithless and twisted generation. And I think that this is not just aimed, like Jesus isn't pointing his finger right at this guy's face. This is aimed at all of them. Because not only is it the people whose faith is not where it should be, but clearly the disciples, their faith isn't where it should be because they failed to do this task that they should be able to do. So we're not going to be too hard on the guy. Jesus, he's going to be harsh when it comes to faithlessness. But he does not stop there. It says in verse 18 that Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. So yes, the father was faithless. Yes, the disciples dropped the ball, but that does not stop Jesus from showing up and doing what Jesus does. The second thing that we're going to see is that Jesus, he grants faith. So he rebukes the faithlessness, but he doesn't stop there. He still helps. And actually, I get this next point. If y'all will allow me, this whole next point is not in Matthew. It's from Mark chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, which will be on the screen. You don't have to get the papers going, but Mark chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. It says that, and Jesus said to him, "If you can," he said, "all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And as I was preparing for this message, and I was flipping back and forth between Matthew and Mark and Luke, and I was trying to make sure that I got the full picture of what was going on here, I couldn't leave that verse off the table. I believe, help my unbelief. So what we see is that, yes, Jesus, he rebukes faithlessness, and he should, but he helps. He grants faith. So he says, help my unbelief, and then Jesus, he heals the boy. We saw that in Matthew 17:18. And this reminds me of what Jesus said back in Matthew chapter 13, verse 12, where he says, "To the one who has a little, more will be given, and it will be given in abundance." What he was talking about there was knowledge about the kingdom of heaven. He was talking about faith. He was talking about his disciples. They're asking, why do we understand the things that you're saying, but they don't? And he's saying, it's because you have faith in me. And if you have faith in me, however little, more is going to be given to you. And we see that playing out in real time with this father. His faith, it's shaky. It's shaky. Jesus acknowledges that. And then he says, and he himself acknowledges it. He says, I believe, I need your help with the unbelief. And Jesus gives it to him. And I think that the lesson in that for us, like that's not a bad verse to make sure that you have memorized. That's not a bad one to hide in your heart. I believe, help me in my unbelief. Because our tendency is, or at least my tendency, I don't want to project anything onto you all, but our tendency is that when our faith is a little shaky, our tendency is usually to put some distance between ourselves and God. We know that we need faith to be able to come before him. So if we perceive that our faith is too small, we leave some distance there between us and God, when we should be doing the opposite, which is, yes, my faith is shaky. Yes, I don't believe like I should. Lord, help my unbelief. Like James says in chapter 4, verse 8, he says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. I had to finish out that verse, so I don't want to chop it in half there. But the lesson for James and the lesson that we see in Mark chapter 9 is don't let whatever it is that you perceive that's going on with you keep you from going to God. Yes, he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, you double-minded. And we all know that sin, just like when our faith is faltering, when we know that there's sin in our lives that we're hanging on to, it stands as a barrier between us and God. It's not a barrier that he can't overcome, but most of the time it's a barrier for us. It stops us when we know that we should be going to God. We know that we should be talking to him more, praying, sitting in his word. But when we have that nag at the back of our mind that we're not good enough to be before God, our tendency is to just kind of stew. Like we just want to sit in our sin when we should be drawing near to God. So James says, draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. So my encouragement for us is that you get that sin out of the way. I feel like that's obvious. Get the sin out of the way. Clear the space between you and God, and despite how you're feeling, go to him. Because even if your faith is not where it should be, he's faithful to grant what you need. We see it in this passage. Even though the disciples failed and the dad failed, Jesus still does what they need him to do. They came to him, their faith wasn't where it should be, but that didn't stop Jesus from showing up. So my encouragement to you is, regardless of how you feel about your personal standing before God, do not let that stop you from going to him. Because he's still going to do what he does, regardless of if we're doing what we should be doing. So that's an encouragement. So he rebukes faithlessness. He grants faith. He's still faithful to do his thing. And then he goes on to teach about the importance of faith and how we can help our faith. So we've been flipping back and forth between Matthew and Mark. Back over in Matthew, picking up in verse 19. And this question is recorded in all three of the Gospels. It says, the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here or there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So Jesus goes on from rebuking faithlessness to showing the importance of faith. Here we see that he's helping the disciples. So he doesn't just stop with faithless generation. He goes on to encourage them. This is why I said that the tone of this passage is not negative. He goes on to encourage and help the disciples, to remind them what faith can accomplish, that there is power in faith. He uses this metaphor, this juxtaposition of images here. So he's saying that faith, even if it's very, 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 very small, like the seed of mustard seed, it can do impossible things like move a mountain. So what Jesus is doing here is we should have these images in our mind together. The teeny tiny little seed and mountains. And that's the power, that's the magnitude of the power that faith has. And I have to say that in case we want to take this verse out of context or take what I'm trying to say out of context, I just want to say that what you put your faith in makes all the difference in what we're talking about here. So this isn't something that you could just slap on the side of a coffee mug. Faith the size of a mustard seed can do anything, because there are infinite things that we can put our faith in. So Jesus didn't say this, but just for our benefit, let me go ahead and say this, that when he's talking about faith, he means faith in him, faith in God. Because really the merit or the strength or the power of any faith is only as good as what your faith is in. That's not theological, that's practical. If I make a paper mache chair and I have faith that it's going to hold me, I'm going to fail. These chairs, these are top of the line chairs. These are quality. Nobody needs to worry. I have faith that these chairs are going to hold up. But just because I have faith does not mean paper mache is going to keep me off the floor. Y'all see what I'm saying? So we're talking about faith, and and what Jesus is saying, I think we were probably already all on the same page about that, but I felt like that had to be stated, that our faith is only as strong as what we're putting it in. And so the the magnitude and the strength of what Jesus is talking about here is because of just takes a little bit of faith in the all-powerful God for the impossible to become possible. In another place in Matthew, Jesus said, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible, because he's the one with the power. Also, another verse, Philippians 4:13, it's a pretty popular verse, famous verse, people know it. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And in that verse, what a lot of times what we tend to forget is that Paul is attributing his ability to endure all situations, not because he's smarter than other people, not because he's just tougher than other people. He's got the grit to go through anything, not because he's so otherworldly minded and detached from the world and aloof that whatever's going on around him doesn't matter. There are people that think that way, that you gotta detach yourself from the world, and then none of that matters. All those things have their limit. But what gives Paul the ability to do all things, to endure all things, all situations, to go through anything, he says it's from God who strengthens him. That power, that ability is not because he's smarter, not because he's tougher, not because he's ascended to a higher level of experience. He attributes that ability to his faith in God, that it's the Lord that strengthens him. And I add that because I think we like to think that way. We like to think that we're above it all. Sometimes we can even beat ourselves up when we find ourselves worrying about things that we know is beneath us, right? We can kick ourselves a little bit when we know that our mind is a little bit too much on the finances, or it's a little bit too much on the current political atmosphere. We want to chide ourselves and say, "Oh, we're better than this. We got better things to deal with. Why are we thinking about these things?" But that kind of stuff, it doesn't just go away by thinking about it more or just trying harder. The power to be able to endure those situations is through faith in God. That power, the thing that man can't do but God can do, it comes from faith in God. And yet, Jesus acknowledges that our faith can be overwhelmed by circumstances. He just said that the impossible, just a little bit of faith, becomes possible. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to acknowledge that sometimes circumstances overwhelm our faith. Like Peter, y'all remember Peter walking on the water, and he's out there with Jesus walking on the water. And then he looks at the waves, and what does he do? He starts to sink. Sometimes the waves overcome our faith, but Jesus he provides some practical support in those moments. Now, depending on what translation you're looking at, the pericope here, the passage might end with verse 20, and then if you notice, what's the next verse? Verse 22. So we see verse 19, verse 20, and verse 22. In fact, in our presentation software, I pulled up the whole passage and I added it in there, and it left out verse 21. And if you're looking at a Bible like mine, you might have a little footnote there that lets you know, a little number, a little indicator that directs your attention to the bottom of your page, and it says some manuscripts insert verse 21, which reads blah 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 blah. Now, this is due to the fact that we have many translations of the Bible in many different languages, and 99% of the time they all line up perfectly. But there's occasions, this is not the only time, even in the book of Matthew, this isn't the only time, where there's a verse that might be in 99 of the manuscripts, but it's not in this one. Or it might be in these 8 over here, but it's not in the other 100. So what our Bible translators do is they didn't want to just cut that and throw it away. They didn't want to just leave it on the floor. So what they do, instead of inserting it into the text, they add it here at the footnote. So this is them kind of splitting the difference. They're like, we don't want to leave it out, but we're also not 100% sure about putting it in. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it in, but at the very bottom. Now, you might have a translation that has it in there, and that's fine. In fact, the reason I'm talking about all this is because I think it should be in there. The translators of the ESV Bible, they weren't so sure. I'm pretty sure. I'm going to leave it in there, and in fact, I have a point that is 100% based on verse 21, which may or may not be in your text. The reason that I want to put it in is because in all three accounts that we get of this interaction between Jesus and his disciples, where they're asking about why couldn't we throw out the demon. In all three accounts, both Mark and Luke include what's in verse 21 here. So Jesus, he says what he just said in Matthew, but then both Mark and Luke include what is left out here in Matthew, which to me gives me all the assurance and liberty that I need to pull 21 up out of the footnotes and put it back in. And the point that verse 21 gives us is that Jesus provides practical support when our faith is overcome by the circumstances. So let's look at what it says. I had to manually type this to get it up on the screen, but what it says is, but this kind never comes out but by prayer and fasting. So let's read verse 20 as well, just so we can make sure that we're keeping our context here. He said to them, because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. But this kind never comes out but by prayer and fasting. Now, an initial reading of that, what I just read, might make us think that this kind of faith never comes out but by prayer and fasting. That's what I initially thought. But Mark and Luke, who both include that in their Gospels, they make it clear that what Jesus is talking about is that it's this kind of spirit that cannot be cast out except by prayer and fasting. So make sure, we did all this work to get 21 back into Matthew, so I want to make sure that we're reading it correctly. So Jesus is saying that all it takes is a little bit of faith, and the impossible becomes possible. But this kind of spirit only comes out by prayer and fasting. So effectively, what he just said is all it takes is a teeny bit of faith for you to move mountains. But sometimes it requires more. Like this situation. The disciples tried to cast the demon out, and they couldn't. And so Jesus is saying that this kind of thing only works with prayer and fasting. Now, to protect us from getting too deep into the weeds of demonology and the nuances of exorcism, let's back away from this and just say the ideas that Jesus is saying here is that with faith we can do the impossible. But when that fails, there's another step that we can add. Are y'all okay with that? Y'all okay with that paraphrase? If we take the truth from speaking specifically about demons, if we take that out and we can apply it to our lives, what Jesus is saying here is that faith can do the impossible, and when faith fails, there's more that you can do. And the more that he says here is prayer and fasting. So let's talk a little bit about those two things, because prayer and fasting, they're not magic wands. I had a conversation with my barber when we were living in Santa Fe, and she was asking me about that, about something. She's like, I fasted about this thing, and God didn't do it. His fasting it doesn't work anymore, or what's the deal with fasting? In her mind, fasting was like a golden ticket. You do this, and God does what you want him to do. That's kind of how we think about prayer sometimes too, right? We pray about it, and that God's going to do it. And then when he doesn't, we're like, like we want to huff. But that's not what prayer and fasting is. These are not magic wands that take our inner desires and bend God to that will. That's not what prayer and fasting is. Prayer, especially when we talk about it in the context of our faith, prayer and fasting are ways to both exemplify and strengthen our faith. Prayer is our personal connection with God. It's our ability to speak to Him and to look to Him for our provisions and for our needs. It's our ability to be in communion with Him and fellowship with Him to His glory. And that's the kind of thing that we don't do if we don't have faith in Him. So that's what I mean by when I say that prayer exemplifies faith, is that it takes faith to pray. But we also find, and I think anybody who's been a Christian for any amount of time, we find that prayer strengthens our faith as well. That the more we do it, even though it takes a little bit of faith to get going, we find that once we get going, once we're into it, our faith is built up. Our faith is strengthened. That God honors that little bit of faith that we bring. He honors that, and it's built up. It's the same thing with fasting. Fasting, we know there's nothing magical about fasting. Fasting is just an exercise for us in faith to be able to remove distractions or remove things in our life to put our focus more on God. So fasting is just a case of, Lord, I want to talk to you. I want to hear from you. I want to see you. I want to pursue you in this, and I want it more than I want lunch. That's what fasting is. Fasting is when you decide, like, yes, lunch is important. This is more important. So I'm gonna set that aside for today, and I'm going to pray, or I'm going to set that aside for the next 24 hours, and I'm going to focus on speaking with God. So these two things, prayer and fasting, I don't want to give y'all the idea of like, in this situation, the disciples go, they can't cast out the demons, and they're like, oh, we got to pray and fast. That's the cheat code to get the demon out. That's not what Jesus is saying here. And I think any of us who have experienced prayer or fasting seriously, we know that that's not what it is. It's just a way for us to, one, express our faith in God, that I trust you as much as I need dinner, and two, a way to build up and encourage our faith by setting other things aside and focusing on God. So prayer and fasting. So that's why I say that Jesus, what he's doing here is he's giving us some practical support for our faith. So if we want to build up our faith, if we want our faith to be stronger, prayer and fasting, it'll get us there. So that's something I think our modern sensibilities, we hear the idea of prayer and fasting a little differently than the disciples did, obviously. We tend to sleep, especially on fasting. We tend to sleep on fasting. But I do think that it's from Jesus, that it is an important way to help and build up our faith. So that was parenthetically, that was verse 21. That Jesus provides practical support for our faith. And finally, as we close, we're going to see that Jesus reminds his disciples, why faith is necessary. Why do we need faith? It's because of verses 22 and 23. It says, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. He'll be raised on the third day. And they were greatly distressed. So the reason I want to connect this, Jesus doesn't say anything about faith in those couple of verses, but the reason I wanted to connect that is because all three of the Gospels, they have this instance, the one that we just read about, and then they have it followed up with Jesus foretelling about his death. And having those two things together opened my eyes to something that I didn't originally see in those previous verses that we just looked at, which was the scene. If y'all remember, the scene was this. Man, his son is possessed by a demon. He goes to the disciples, and they can't heal him. They can't cast out the demon. So what does he do? He goes to Jesus, and then Jesus casts out the demon. So what Jesus is doing here, he reminds them, I think in this situation, in what just happened, the very last thing that you want to hear about is the fact that Jesus is going away. Because that was like the safety, right? Like that was bringing in the big guns. The disciples couldn't do it. So then he went to Jesus, and Jesus did it easily. By the way, let me point out the fact that Jesus just said that this demon can only come out by prayer and fasting, right? That's what he said. Those kinds only come out by prayer and fasting. Jesus neither prayed nor fasted, and the demon came out instantly. I don't think that this is a disconnect in Jesus' logic here. I think Jesus is proving that while it takes faith and prayer and fasting and intentionality and work on our part, he does it with a word. He does it accidentally. He just, get out of here, demon. He does it immediately because he's the one with the power. So Jesus is saying that I'm the one with the power. The thing that I just told you that you couldn't do, the thing that I just told you takes all this work and time and intentionality. I just did it with a word. And then he says, and I'm leaving. I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be handed over. He does say that he's going to be raised on the third day, but verse 23 makes it clear that does not make them feel better. It says they were greatly distressed because they know they just saw Jesus come in and save the day when they had dropped the ball. And now Jesus is reminding them again, remember, this is going to be looming over everything that we see for the next few months. He reminds them again, I'm not going to be with you forever. That's why we need faith. The reason that we're talking about faith, the reason we're talking about standing firm in faith is because we don't have the benefit of Jesus' physical presence with us. We don't have the benefit that the disciples had of, sorry, we can't do it. We should go talk to Jesus. Not in a physical sense, though, right? We know post-Pentecost that we have his Spirit living in us. So in a real sense, we do have his presence with us, but not physically, not reach out and touch it. Presence. That's why we need faith. We need faith until his physical presence returns. And once that happens, we can set faith aside. We don't need faith anymore, and we can go on rejoicing in the glory of the Son for all eternity. What are we saying after 10,000 years? We'll still have plenty of time. Just as much time as when we started. But for now, in that time between, for now, it requires faith. If we're going to endure the doubts and the trials and the hardships that we experience here in this life, we have to have faith. And I hope after what we've just read that we have some real-time practical ways that we can hold on to that faith, regardless of how we're feeling, regardless of what's going on around us. We press into the Lord. It's his power that we're depending on, not ours. He's faithful. We draw near to him. He draws near to us. So Stan's going to come back up. We're going to close, and I encourage you as we go into a time of reflection, a time of invitation. I encourage you all to take this time to be honest, serious with yourself about where your faith is, and to look to God to strengthen it, to sustain it, whatever you need. Our faith is not something that we can set on autopilot and expect to just be carried on through until we die or until the Lord returns.